In the shadow of the New World's unclaimed riches, three empires circle like wolves. Spain holds gold, England seeks revenge, and France sharpens its ambitions. The 1590s weren't just a land rush, they were a powder keg of religion, piracy, and power. The First Global Empire War had already begun. In 1492, the sails of 3 Spanish ships cut across the Atlantic, unknowingly setting the world on a new axis. Behind them stood Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, unified Catholic monarchs who had just completed the Reconquista and expelled the last Muslim kingdom from Iberia. But they wanted more. Their eyes had turned west. What followed would reshape not just Europe, but the very geography of power. By the time the 1590s arrived, Spain was not merely a kingdom, it was a global juggernaut. It possessed the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the Philippines. And at its heart was a single word: plunder. Silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas, gold from the temples of the Aztecs and Incas, and a divine mandate to conquer not just for glory, but for God. Spain's empire didn't expand slowly. It exploded. In fewer than 50 years, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro toppled mighty indigenous civilizations. They used muskets, steel, horses, and more devastatingly, disease. Smallpox ravaged native populations before many Spanish ever lifted a sword. In some areas, up to 90% of the indigenous population would die within a century of contact. But Spain wasn't interested in merely planting flags. They wanted structure, institutions, control. The Council of the Indies was created in 1524 to oversee colonial administration. Viceroyalties were established in New Spain, Mexico, and Peru, governed like mini-monarchies in the king's name. Spanish law, Spanish taxes, and Spanish religion flowed west across the Atlantic, smothering local customs under layers of imperial bureaucracy. The Catholic Church became both sword and shield. Missionaries flooded the Americas, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, intent on converting indigenous peoples. They built churches, schools, and missions, often side by side with military forts. Christianity was the moral justification for conquest, but it also became the cultural weapon that erased languages, idols, and ancestral memory. Meanwhile, galleons loaded with treasure made their perilous way back to Seville. These were no ordinary merchant ships. They were floating fortresses, protected by massive armadas, sailing through waters teeming with pirates and rival navies. The flow of silver into Spain was staggering. From 1500 to 1650, it's estimated that over 150,000 tons of silver entered Europe from the Americas, most of it controlled by Spain. This wealth made Spain the envy of every court in Europe, and the target of envy. The empire could finance wars, bribe kings, and subsidize religious crusades. But wealth on this scale came with a price: dependency. Spain's economy became addicted to silver. Manufacturing declined. Agriculture suffered. Inflation surged. And the more silver they brought in, the more their domestic economy twisted under the weight of its own excess. Spain's colonial rule was also inherently unstable. Beneath the surface, discontent brewed. The indigenous peoples, those who survived the epidemics and forced conversions, were often subjected to the encomienda system, a brutal form of labor tribute that resembled slavery. Spanish settlers were granted land and workers, promising in return to Christianize and protect the indigenous people. In reality, it became a license for exploitation. Some Spaniards themselves were horrified. In 1552, Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas published a short account of the destruction of the Indies, a chilling indictment of Spanish cruelty. He described massacres, burnings, and forced labor with graphic detail. His voice sparked debates in Spain and abroad about the morality of empire, debates that echoed through the next century. But by the 1590s, Spain still stood unchallenged. The Portuguese had explored earlier, but had focused eastward, toward Africa, India, and the Spice Islands. France was racked with internal wars between Catholics and Huguenots. England was only beginning to dream of colonization. Spain, in contrast, ruled over millions of subjects, controlled vast territories, and had global reach. Their empire spanned 4 continents. It was said that the sun never set on Spanish dominions. But cracks were beginning to show. The cost of the empire was draining. Wars in Europe, especially against the Ottoman Empire and Protestant rivals, bled the treasury dry. The Spanish Armada, launched against England in 1588, ended in disaster. Storms and mismanagement scattered the fleet, marking a turning point in naval supremacy. Though Spain still held immense power, it had proven vulnerable. In the Americas, indigenous revolts simmered, especially in remote areas. In Peru, the Inca resistance lingered for decades after the conquest. In northern Mexico, nomadic tribes raided Spanish settlements with impunity. The vastness of the land made complete control an illusion. Even in the Caribbean, the Spanish struggled to maintain order on islands ravaged by disease, hurricanes, and outside threats. And then there were the rivals. England, emboldened by the Armada's failure, began sending privateers to raid Spanish treasure ships. France, recovering from its religious wars, resumed its colonial ambitions. The Dutch, in rebellion against Spain in Europe, began attacking Spanish ports across the Atlantic. Spain had built an empire of gold, but now it had to defend it. By the end of the 1590s, Spain's golden century was still shining, but it was flickering. The very success of their conquests had made them complacent. The silver that had built a global empire was also poisoning its foundations, and as the 17th century dawned, new powers would rise to challenge the throne Spain had built. The empire that struck first had cast a long shadow, but in the darkness of its triumph, others had learned how to follow and how to fight back. The Spanish didn't just stumble into an empire, they engineered it. By the dawn of the 1600s, Spain had transformed vast and unfamiliar territories in the Americas into an administrative machine powered by faith, precious metals, and forced labor. At its center stood a singular idea: absolute monarchy stretched across oceans. The king ruled not just over Spaniards, but over millions of indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and mixed-race subjects, most of whom would never set foot in Europe. To govern such an empire, Spain built a complex colonial bureaucracy. It began with the Council of the Indies, seated in Seville, acting as the nerve center of imperial control. Every law, appointment, and shipment had to pass through this council, with its reach extending from Peruvian mountain valleys to Caribbean sugar fields. In theory, it was an all-seeing eye. In practice, the distance between decree and reality often spanned years. The New World was carved into viceroyalties, quasi-kingdoms that mimicked the Spanish court. The viceroyalty of New Spain ruled over Central America, Mexico, and parts of the Caribbean. The viceroyalty of Peru controlled much of South America. Each was led by a viceroy, the king's stand-in, complete with ceremonial robes, gold-threaded staffs, and the power to command armies. Beneath the viceroys were audiencias, high courts, governors, and local magistrates, all tied by webs of paperwork and political loyalty. But colonial control wasn't just a matter of soldiers and scribes. It rested on 2 pillars: gold and God. Silver was the lifeblood of the Spanish Empire. Gold dazzled, but silver sustained. From the massive Potosi mine in present-day Bolivia to Zacatecas in Mexico, Spain built an extractive economy that stripped the land of its riches with brutal efficiency. Indigenous peoples were conscripted through the Maita system, a colonial adaptation of an old Incan labor tax, forced to work months underground in pitch-dark tunnels with crude tools and poisonous mercury. The output was staggering. By 1600, Potosi alone was producing nearly 60% of the world's silver. But the human cost was catastrophic. Collapsed lungs, mercury poisoning, deaths from cave-ins. Entire communities disappeared, their sons buried beneath the very ore that enriched Europe. To move these riches back to Spain, the Crown developed a military and logistical feat unmatched at the time. The treasure fleet, dozens of massive galleons, each armed to the teeth, carried silver, gold, and goods from Havana to Seville. The fleet sailed only once or twice a year, protected by naval convoys to ward off pirates and foreign navies. The system was rigid, scheduled, and predictable, but vital. Every delay meant delayed taxes, wages, and weapons for Spain's endless European wars. The economy back home bent under the weight of this dependency. Prices in Spain soared with each arrival of silver. Local manufacturing collapsed as cheaper goods from the colonies or foreign lands flooded the market. And the silver didn't stay in Spain long. It flowed eastward, fueling a vast global trade that reached as far as China, where silver was the primary currency. Ironically, the wealth that made Spain an empire also eroded its foundation. Yet money alone didn't justify conquest. Religion did. The Spanish crown had a sacred mission: to spread Catholicism to the New World. This was no afterthought. It was state policy. The Pope had granted Spain vast spiritual authority over the Americas through the Patronato Real, allowing the monarchs to appoint bishops, oversee missions, and shape the religious life of the colonies. It was church and state, fused into a single imperial tool. Every significant Spanish settlement had its cathedral. Every frontier town had its mission. Jesuits, Franciscans, and Dominicans poured into the Americas, building churches, teaching Spanish, and burning indigenous idols. They weren't just saving souls, they were reshaping minds. Indigenous languages were suppressed. Ancestor worship was outlawed. The Spanish cross became both a symbol of salvation and submission. Yet the role of the church was complex. While many priests justified conquest as a divine mandate, others emerged as fierce defenders of indigenous rights. Bartolomé de las Casas, once a slaveholder, became one of Spain's loudest critics, arguing that conquest had turned into genocide. His writings shook the conscience of Europe and helped spark the new laws of 1542, which sought to limit indigenous enslavement and reform the encomienda system. But reforms rarely made it to the front lines. In rural zones, colonial settlers ignored Madrid. They exploited native workers, waged private wars, and justified it all with theology. Meanwhile, the church amassed wealth, owning lands, collecting tithes, and sometimes acting like feudal lords themselves. In many areas, the church was the state. The colonial caste system reinforced control. Spaniards born in Europe, peninsulares, occupied the top of society. Below them were criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, wealthy but barred from top offices. Then came mestizos, mixed indigenous and Spanish, indigenous peoples, and Africans. The entire social structure was racialized, codified, and policed. This system bred resentment. Criollos chafed at their exclusion. Mestizos lived between worlds. Indigenous communities bore the brunt of labor, taxation, and religious erasure. But Spain needed this pyramid. It was the only way to maintain authority over lands so vast, with so few soldiers and bureaucrats. And so, gold and God marched together. Every mine had its chapel. Every church had its tribute. Spain's empire in the Americas wasn't just a colony of trade. It was a world system. It extracted wealth, imposed belief, and enforced hierarchy with breathtaking precision. But beneath its gleaming surface, the empire trembled. Its riches made it a target. Its system bred inequality. And on every frontier, whether in Mexico, Peru, or the Philippines, its authority was challenged by indigenous resistance, foreign rivals, and its own internal contradictions. In the coming decades, that trembling would become a quake. By the late 1500s, England was still a spectator in the colonial race, watching from the foggy shores of the North Sea as Spain and Portugal carved up the globe. While Spanish galleons returned home, heavy with silver, and Catholic missionaries fanned across the Americas, England remained landlocked in ambition, a second-tier power plagued by internal strife and hesitant monarchs. But all that was about to change. The turning point wasn't a grand invasion or a royal decree. It began with piracy, a crude, desperate attempt to tap into the riches of the New World by force. England's early ventures into empire were soaked in salt water and smoke. Men like John Hawkins and Francis Drake didn't discover new lands. They attacked Spanish ones. Hawkins became infamous for pioneering England's entry into the Atlantic slave trade, kidnapping Africans and selling them to Spanish colonies against Spanish law. When his final voyage ended in disaster in 1568, trapped and attacked in a Mexican port, he returned home burning with revenge. Drake took it further. In the 1570s and 80s, he raided ports across the Caribbean, looted Spanish settlements, and even circumnavigated the globe, becoming a national hero and a knight in the process. Spain called him a criminal. England called him El Drake, the dragon who tormented an empire. These state-sanctioned pirates, privateers, weren't anomalies. They were England's shadow navy. Lacking a proper colonial infrastructure, Elizabeth I turned to them as tools of economic warfare. Their raids not only disrupted Spanish trade, but also tested the waters for future settlements. Every port they burned was a map drawn in fire. But piracy alone couldn't sustain an empire. England needed a moral cause, a reason to justify colonization beyond greed. It found one in Protestantism. The Protestant Reformation had split Europe into two. Spain, fiercely Catholic, viewed its conquests as holy work, spreading the true faith to pagan souls. England, now a Protestant nation under Elizabeth I, painted a different picture. The New World, they argued, was not Spain's inheritance. It was God's battlefield, and the Catholic Church had betrayed Christ. This wasn't just a religious rivalry. It became a tool of empire. Propaganda flourished. English writers described Spanish rule in the Americas as brutal and satanic. They published shocking accounts of Spanish cruelty, highlighting the torture and slaughter of indigenous peoples in what became known as the Black Legend. Though many of these stories were exaggerated or outright false, they served their purpose: to cast England as the righteous alternative, the savior of the oppressed. Colonization became moral theater. To settle the New World was not to conquer, it was to redeem. The English would not enslave, they claimed. They would civilize. The Spanish had brought chains. The English would bring liberty, order, and the Word of God. In reality, England would bring its own version of conquest. But for now, the image was enough. As Spain grew wealthy and complacent, England grew bold. Explorers and investors sought to plant colonies, not as extensions of royal power, but as commercial experiments. The first was Roanoke, founded in 1585 under the sponsorship of Sir Walter Raleigh. Roanoke was a gamble. Set on the coast of what is now North Carolina, it was isolated, poorly supplied, and politically fragile. The first settlers struggled with food shortages and tense relations with local indigenous tribes. By 1590, when resupply ships finally returned, the colony had vanished, leaving behind only a cryptic word carved into a tree: Croatoan. Roanoke became known as the Lost Colony. To England, it was a lesson in humility. But it didn't end the dream. In fact, it sharpened it. The failure was blamed not on England's inexperience, but on bad luck and poor planning. The next attempt, many believed, would succeed. By the turn of the century, England had gained momentum. Its ships had proven they could cross the Atlantic. Its pirates had shown that Spain was not invincible. Its writers had cast the empire as a moral crusade. And in 1588, with the defeat of the Spanish Armada, England had scored its most symbolic victory yet. A naval triumph that seemed to signal the decline of Spanish power and the dawn of English expansion. But an empire doesn't rise overnight. England still lacked the money, workforce, and experience of Spain. It had no viceroys, no treasure fleets, no religious orders to pacify the frontiers. It had hope, ambition, and an emerging ideology that blended commerce, religion, and nationalism into a single vision. The seeds were planted. A Protestant nation, driven by maritime daring, hungry for markets, and clothed in moral superiority. The New World was no longer Spain's alone. The English were coming, and their empire would look very different from the one they intended to replace. The year was 1607. After decades of false starts, lost colonies, and pirate raids, England finally planted a flag in the New World. This time, not as thieves or missionaries, but as settlers. On the banks of a muddy river in what is now Virginia, 104 men and boys stepped ashore and built the foundations of what would become the first permanent English settlement in America, Jamestown. But permanence was not guaranteed. In fact, it almost didn't happen. Jamestown wasn't a royal project. It was a business venture funded by the newly formed Virginia Company, a group of London investors eager to profit from colonization. They sold shares in the idea that gold, spices, or trade with Asia might be found on America's eastern shore. The settlers were not farmers or survivalists. Many were gentlemen, noble by birth, soft by experience. They expected adventure and riches. What they found was swampy land, brackish water, and disease. The location, chosen for its defensibility against Spanish attack, was a nightmare. Malaria ran rampant. The settlers had little knowledge of how to grow food or purify water. Within months, half the colonists were dead. Still, they endured. Why? Partly out of desperation, but also because failure now had consequences. This wasn't Roanoke. This was England's last chance to prove it could build a foothold in the Americas. The worst came in the winter of 1609 to 1610, a season that would go down in history as the starving time. By then, supplies from England had been delayed. Relations with the local Powhatan Confederacy, once tense but manageable, had broken down into open hostility. The settlers were trapped in their crude fort, surrounded by forests they feared, and people who now saw them as invaders. Food ran out. Men ate rats, shoe leather, and tree bark. One account, widely circulated back in England, spoke of cannibalism. A desperate man digging up the corpse of his wife and roasting her. Whether true or exaggerated, the horror was absolute. Only 60 of the 500 settlers survived the winter. When spring came, the survivors prepared to abandon Jamestown. They loaded their boats and began sailing downriver. But at the last moment, they met a new fleet arriving from England. Fresh supplies, fresh settlers, and a new governor, Lord de la Warr. They turned around. Jamestown would live. No story of Jamestown is complete without John Smith, the soldier-turned-leader whose strict discipline and leadership helped hold the colony together in its early days. And of course, there's Pocahontas, the daughter of Chief Powhatan, enshrined in folklore as the girl who saved Smith from execution. But the truth is murkier. The event Smith described may have been a ceremonial adoption, not a rescue. And Pocahontas was a child, likely around 11 or 12 at the time. Later, she would be captured by the English, converted to Christianity, renamed Rebecca, and married off to settler John Rolfe. She died in England in 1617 at the age of 21, paraded as a symbol of harmony between cultures. But behind the image was a more profound truth. The relationship between colonists and natives was not peaceful. It was a war of worlds, and Pocahontas was caught in the middle. Jamestown didn't thrive because of diplomacy. It survived because of tobacco. In 1612, John Rolfe began experimenting with a new strain of tobacco from the Caribbean. It was sweeter, more palatable to European tastes, and soon became Jamestown's lifeline. By 1617, England was importing over 20,000 pounds of the stuff annually. 2 years later, that number tripled. Tobacco became Virginia's cash crop, the engine of its economy. But it came with consequences. It exhausted the soil quickly, forcing settlers to expand into indigenous lands. And it required labor, lots of it. At first, that labor came from indentured servants, poor Englishmen who signed away years of freedom in exchange for passage to the New World. But this model wouldn't last. In 1619, a ship arrived in Jamestown carrying 20 African captives, marking the beginning of what would become America's original sin, slavery. Also in 1619, something unprecedented occurred: the formation of the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in English America. For the first time, free settlers had a say in their governance. It was a sign that Jamestown was no longer an outpost. It was becoming a society. But while some gained voice, others were silenced. Indigenous tribes continued to lose land and lives, and enslaved Africans had no rights at all. The system of governance that took root in Jamestown would shape the future United States, but so too would the contradictions it carried. Freedom for some, bondage for others. Jamestown began as a business experiment. It nearly ended as a cautionary tale. But somehow, through grit, exploitation, and luck, it endured. And in doing so, it set the pattern for English colonization. Corporate-driven, labor-intensive, expansionist, and deeply entangled in race and class. What happened on the banks of the James River would echo for centuries. In 1622, the quiet forests of Virginia erupted in blood. It was not the first time that conflict had scarred the land between English settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy. But this time it came with fury, planning, and precision. On the morning of March 22nd, Powhatan warriors entered English settlements under the pretense of peace. They brought gifts, they smiled, and then they struck. Axes, knives, and clubs turned the soil red. In a matter of hours, over 350 English settlers, men, women, and children, were dead. 1/3 of the Virginia colony was wiped out in what would come to be known as the Great Massacre of 1622. The English called it savagery, but to the Powhatan, it was retaliation. From the very first landing at Jamestown, relations between the English and indigenous people had been fraught. The English, unlike the French who traded and intermarried, or the Spanish who converted and conquered, came to stay. They claimed land, fenced fields, and planted tobacco, treating the Powhatan homeland as though it were uninhabited. At first, Chief Wahunsonacock, known to the English simply as Powhatan, tried diplomacy. He traded food for tools and weapons. He tolerated their strange customs. But as English settlements grew, so did the pressure on native lands, rivers, and hunting grounds. The balance tipped when new waves of colonists arrived, ignorant of the fragile peace. When Powhatan died, his brother, Opechancanough, took command. He had seen the future. He knew that these pale invaders would never stop. So he made a choice: strike first, strike hard. What made the 1622 attack so shocking wasn't just the scale, it was the cunning. Opechancanough had planned it for months. Settlements miles apart were struck almost simultaneously. In some places, warriors had even dined with the English the night before. The betrayal was deliberate, a warning that the Powhatan were not broken. But the English responded with brutal resolve. They declared a perpetual war against the Powhatan. For years afterward, colonists raided villages, burned crops, poisoned wells, and launched surprise attacks. Entire towns were erased from the map. At one point, they invited native leaders to a peace banquet, then served them poisoned wine. This was not a war in the traditional European sense. It was extermination by attrition. By 1644, Opechancanough, now in his 90s and nearly blind, launched one final uprising. It failed. He was captured, paraded through Jamestown in chains, and shot in the back by a soldier while in custody. With his death, the Powhatan Confederacy effectively collapsed. After the uprising, English officials shifted their strategy. They knew they couldn't fight every native group head-on forever. So instead, they began a policy of divide and rule. Tribes that resisted were destroyed. Tribes that submitted were rewarded with trade goods, tools, weapons, even status. Treaties were signed, but they always favored the English. Over time, English maps began to reflect a new kind of dominion, not just over land, but over the very identity of native peoples. Tribes were relocated. Their political autonomy was dismantled. And slowly, native presence was erased from the narrative of Virginia's growth. What had begun as a trade relationship had now become a colonial order. In the aftermath of the uprisings, English writers and politicians crafted a powerful narrative that the natives were treacherous and barbaric, incapable of peace. This story served a purpose. It justified more land seizures, more military campaigns, and more slavery. But the historical record tells a different story. The Powhatan did not emerge from chaos. Their violence was calculated, a response to invasion, not its cause. Their civilization had laws, leaders, agriculture, and diplomacy. But English colonists, with their Eurocentric lens, dismissed all of it as primitive. It was easier, after all, to take a people's land when you've convinced yourself they don't truly own it. Though the Powhatan Confederacy was shattered, its resistance set a precedent. Indigenous nations across North America would take note. Some would fight, some would negotiate, others would retreat deeper into forests and mountains. But none would forget that once, in Virginia, an alliance of native peoples had nearly driven out one of Europe's rising empires. Today, descendants of the Powhatan still live in Virginia. Some serve in the U.S. military. Others work to preserve language, heritage, and identity. Their continued presence is a quiet defiance of history's attempt to bury them. Jamestown may have survived, but it did so through blood and fire. The colony's growth came not from peaceful coexistence, but from the silencing of those who had lived there for thousands of years. Powhatan's fury was not the end of native resistance. It was only the beginning of a centuries-long struggle for land, dignity, and survival. The colony of Jamestown was never truly self-sufficient. From the moment the first settlers stepped ashore in 1607, their survival depended not just on local food or native diplomacy, but on a far greater force moving silently across the ocean: the Atlantic lifeline. Ships from England carried more than barrels of grain or crates of tools. They brought identity, purpose, and profit. Without them, the colony would wither. With them, it became a node in an emerging global empire. In the first years, supply ships were unreliable, and the consequences were often fatal. The winter of 1609 to 1610, remembered as the starving time, nearly ended the colony. Jamestown's population fell from 500 to just 60. Desperate settlers ate horses, rats, leather belts, and, according to some accounts, even resorted to cannibalism. This happened because a critical supply fleet was delayed. That fleet, known as the Third Supply, had faced storms, shipwrecks, and bad luck. One of its ships, the Sea Venture, crashed on the shores of Bermuda. Survivors would spend months building a new ship from the wreckage before finally reaching Virginia in 1610. They arrived to find skeletons. Jamestown, barely alive, was on the verge of abandonment. It was only the timely arrival of Lord De La Warr, with fresh supplies and new orders from London, that stopped the colonists from fleeing. His fleet turned them around, literally, and forced the experiment to continue. The message was clear. Jamestown was not optional. It was an investment. And investors were watching. Back in England, Jamestown wasn't seen as a sanctuary for people with low incomes or a noble mission of salvation. It was a business venture. The Virginia Company had sold shares to nobles, merchants, and tradespeople. In return, they expected gold, timber, fish, anything profitable. But what they got instead was hunger, conflict, and silence. For years, returns on investment were non-existent. That changed with one plant, tobacco. By the 1610s, the colony had found its first real cash crop. It wasn't native to Virginia, but once introduced, it flourished in the soil and climate. Colonists scrambled to grow it. Fields replaced forests. Labor became an obsession. And ships, once carrying food, now returned to England heavy with brown gold. Tobacco didn't just save Jamestown, it transformed the colony into a commodity factory. And that meant a new level of dependence on the Atlantic. To fuel this growing engine, the colony needed workers. At first, it relied on indentured servants from England, men and women who signed away 5 to 7 years of their life for a ticket across the ocean and a slim chance at land afterward. But this system had limits. Many servants died before their contracts ended. Others survived, but became rebellious or poor squatters. And the work was relentless. So colonial leaders turned to a different solution: African slavery. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia aboard the White Lion, a privateer ship. They were stolen from a Portuguese slave vessel and sold into the colony. Some were treated as indentured servants. Others were enslaved for life. Either way, their arrival marked the beginning of a transformation that would link Virginia not just to England, but to Africa, the Caribbean, and the wider Atlantic world. Trade routes soon formed a triangle: English goods to Africa, African slaves to the Americas, and American crops, tobacco, sugar, cotton, back to England. Jamestown was no longer just a lonely colony. It was part of the Atlantic system, where human lives were bought, sold, and shipped like cargo. By the 1620s and 1630s, England's ambitions stretched far beyond Virginia. They now saw the Americas not as a single colony, but as a web of potential power. New settlements sprang up: Bermuda, Barbados, and Massachusetts. Each had a different climate, economy, and purpose. But they shared one thing: they were all dependent on ships, and they were all expected to generate wealth. In London, merchants grew rich off colonial goods. Investors poured money into charters and expeditions. The Crown, once a cautious observer, now stepped in more directly. After the Virginia Company collapsed in 1624, the King made Virginia a royal colony. It was no longer just a business. It was an arm of the English state. Jamestown had become a proof of concept. And the Atlantic, once a vast, terrifying void, was now a corridor of empire. But this lifeline came with consequences. Colonists became reliant on imported tools, cloth, guns, and even food. Prices were set in London. Policies were dictated from afar. And when war broke out in Europe, or when storms delayed ships, the colonies suffered. Local economies remained fragile. Starvation always lurked. And when Native American lands were seized to plant more tobacco, conflict exploded again and again. Still, The flow of ships never stopped. And with each passing year, more settlers arrived. More plantations grew. And more enslaved people were forced ashore. Today, when we think of early America, we often imagine a self-reliant frontier. But the truth is, Jamestown survived because it was tethered to something larger. The Atlantic lifeline, supply ships, trade routes, imperial ambitions was the artery that kept the colony alive. It carried people, profit, power, and pain. It built an empire not from the soil up, but from the ocean in. And it would shape not only Jamestown's future, but the fate of an entire continent. In a humid summer of 1619, in a wooden church at Jamestown, history was quietly made. No trumpets blared, no kings watched. But as the doors creaked open and 2 representatives from each of Virginia's 11 settlements filed in, something revolutionary was beginning. It was called the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas. And though its powers were modest, its implications were immense. In a land ruled by charter, governed by distant investors and crown-appointed governors, the colonists had carved out a space for self-rule. Here, in the heart of a swampy frontier, democracy had taken root in the soil of empire. Jamestown's early years had been marked by desperation, starvation, war, chaos. Governance was martial, absolute power in the hands of a governor who issued commands like a battlefield general. Laws were brutal, punishments swift. But as the colony stabilized, thanks to tobacco profits, growing migration, and improved supplies, so too did the need for structure. The Virginia Company, still eager to entice settlers, knew they had to offer more than misery. So, in 1618, they unveiled the Great Charter. It promised land ownership, the right to elect representatives, and a shift from military rule to civil government. The following year, the House of Burgesses convened for the first time. It wasn't a grand hall of polished marble. It was a makeshift space, hot, cramped, insect-ridden. But it was here that colonists began debating laws, taxes, and grievances. They weren't nobles or elites. Many were planters, traders, or adventurers. But they were speaking for themselves. This was no longer England. And the rules, slowly, were changing. The early House of Burgesses had limited power. The governor could veto its decisions. The company could override them. But the symbolic value was undeniable. Colonists weren't just subjects. They were participants. They debated issues like tobacco prices, relations with native tribes, labor laws, and infrastructure. They passed codes to regulate behavior, enforce contracts, and manage trade. They even petitioned London for reforms. For many, this was their first taste of political agency. In England, most commoners had no vote, no voice. But in Virginia, even a modest landowner could become a burgess, a lawmaker in the New World. The concept was radical. Representation wasn't a gift. It was a right earned by toil and rooted in the soil. And once granted, it would never be easily surrendered. But self-rule in Jamestown was not universal. By 1619, Africans had arrived in the colony. Some were enslaved, others were indentured. None were represented, nor were women. Though increasing in number, they had no legal standing as voters or office holders. Even many Englishmen, those without land, were excluded from the franchise. And most tragically, indigenous voices were silenced entirely. The House of Burgesses made laws that seized native lands, punished resistance, and codified the colony's expansion. Diplomatic treaties were sometimes signed, but rarely honored. And as settlers pushed west, conflict followed. Still, within the English settler community, the idea of representative government became gospel. It was messy, flawed, exclusionary. But it was also alive and evolving. Governance in Virginia was never simple. Royal governors, appointed first by the Virginia Company, and later by the Crown, wielded enormous power. They could dissolve the House, override laws, and rule by decree. But they also had to contend with colonists who saw themselves as co-rulers, not mere subjects. Tensions flared constantly. Planters wanted low taxes. Merchants wanted fewer restrictions. Landowners wanted more territory. And the House of Burgesses became their mouthpiece. When governors ignored them, protests erupted. When taxes rose without consent, petitions flooded London. The colonists had learned to argue, negotiate, and resist. Not with weapons, but with words and laws. This adversarial spirit, born in Jamestown, would echo across generations. By the 1670s, Virginia was still a colony. But its government had matured. New counties had their own courts. Local sheriffs enforced colonial law. The House of Burgesses met regularly, passing statutes, levying taxes, and shaping the future. Even after the Virginia Company dissolved in 1624 and the colony became royal, the Burgesses continued their work. Crown authority might loom large, but local control had become habitual. What began as an experiment in 1619 had become an expectation by the late 1600s. Colonists no longer just asked for rights, they asserted them, and they would fight to defend them. The legacy of the House of Burgesses didn't end in Virginia. It inspired assemblies in Maryland, the Carolinas, and Massachusetts. It shaped the thinking of men like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington, all Virginians who would one day rebel against monarchy itself. Jamestown's wooden church had long since crumbled. But the idea born there of a people governing themselves in defiance of distance and hierarchy would become the beating heart of a nation. At dawn on March 22, 1622, the settlers of Virginia awoke to another seemingly normal spring day. Tobacco fields shimmered with dew. The rivers were calm, and colonial life continued as usual. But hidden among their homes, farms, and trading posts, indigenous warriors waited, trusted familiar faces. Some even baptized, others working in English households, had been preparing for weeks. Then, as the sun climbed over the James River, the killing began. Axes, clubs, fire. By nightfall, 347 colonists lay dead, nearly a third of Virginia's English population. This was no raid. It was a coordinated assault, a declaration of war, and a reminder from the Powhatan Confederacy. The land was not conquered. It was only borrowed, and the debt was now being collected. The seeds of violence had been planted years before. The English and the Powhatan had never truly understood each other. Their early peace, forged in moments like John Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas, was fragile, dependent on trade, mutual need, and diplomacy. But as the 1610s turned to the 1620s, things changed. The English population was growing rapidly. Tobacco, the colony's economic engine, demanded land, vast swaths of it. Settlers spread beyond the initial confines of Jamestown, cutting forests, fencing fields, and encroaching on indigenous territories. To the Powhatan, this wasn't coexistence. It was an invasion. Chief Opachancanos, successor to Wahun Senecau, Powhatan's brother or cousin, depending on sources, saw clearly what many had not. The English weren't temporary visitors. They were builders of a new world, and that world left no room for his people. So he plotted, patiently, quietly, relentlessly. The brilliance and brutality of the 1622 attack lay in its timing and execution. For years, the Powhatan had played the game of diplomacy. They attended church, worked in settler homes, learned English customs. It was all part of the plan. On the morning of March 22nd, those relationships became weapons. From Henricus to Martin's Hundred, the violence was swift and intimate. English settlers, caught completely off guard, were killed while eating breakfast, tilling fields, or walking to church. In some places, entire families were wiped out. In others, only a handful survived to tell the tale. Jamestown itself was spared, thanks to a last-minute warning from a Christian converted native boy who had learned of the plot and alerted the garrison. But even there, panic reigned. Virginia had never felt more vulnerable. If the Powhatan intended the massacre to push the English out, the result was the opposite. The settlers were shocked, outraged, terrified. But above all, they were galvanized. The Virginia Company declared a perpetual war. No more treaties, no more negotiations. From 1622 onward, English policy became one of open hostility. Kill, burn, displace. Entire villages were razed, crops destroyed, captives executed. The colonists hunted the Powhatan in a campaign of attrition, driving them deeper into the forests and away from the rivers that had once been their lifelines. But this war had a second casualty: the Virginia Company itself. News of the massacre and the company's failure to protect its settlers reached England with horror. Investors were disillusioned. The Crown intervened. By 1624, King James revoked the company's charter. Virginia became a royal colony, ruled directly by the Crown. In the ashes of violence, the foundation of imperial control was laid. The massacre of 1622 didn't end the Powhatan Confederacy, but it broke its momentum. Opechancanough would launch another major attack in 1644, killing hundreds more settlers. But this time, the English response was total. Within 2 years, he was captured and shot in the back, blind, paralyzed, and over 100 years old. The Confederacy was fragmented. Its people were pushed to the margins, treaties signed in desperation. Yet the lesson of 1622 haunted English minds for generations. The myth of indigenous submission was shattered. The colonists now saw native peoples not just as trading partners or obstacles, but as enduring threats. It justified expansion, fortifications, militias, preemptive strikes. The idea of peaceful coexistence, already strained, was buried beneath blood and fire. But not all Englishmen agreed on how to respond. Some clergymen argued that the massacre was a divine punishment, a judgment for greed, cruelty, or failure to convert the heathen. Others called for restraint, fearing that brutality would doom all future diplomacy. Meanwhile, in England, debates raged in pamphlets and courts. Was colonization still worth it? Could profit justify such carnage? The massacre had made one thing clear: the Americas were not a blank slate. They were a living world, ancient, occupied, and unwilling to surrender. For the English, the massacre of 1622 became a foundational trauma, a story retold in sermons, books, and policy. It shaped colonial psychology, a constant fear of rebellion, a justification for conquest. For the Powhatan, it marked the last gasp of dominance, a brilliant but doomed attempt to reclaim their world. Today, historians still debate its legacy. Was it genocide? Resistance? A miscalculated act of desperation? What's undeniable is that the event marked a turning point. After 1622, Virginia ceased being an experiment. It became a fortress, and a colony built not on fragile partnerships, but on force, fear, and frontier law. The blood spilled that spring morning would seep into every page of America's colonial history. And it all began with trust, betrayed in silence. In the years following the massacre of 1622, Virginia was changed. The landscape was scarred by war. The rivers flowed past burned villages, and the colony, once a fragile outpost of English ambition, began to harden into something more enduring and more unequal. What emerged was not a land of free men, but a land of masters. The plantation elite, a small group of powerful landowners, began to rise, reshaping the social, economic, and political fabric of English America. They weren't kings, but they wielded near-royal influence. Their wealth came from tobacco. Their power came from the and their grip on the colony would last for generations. This was the actual birth of the Southern aristocracy. At the heart of Virginia's transformation was its golden crop, tobacco. Introduced to Europe in the 16th century and popularized by the English in the early 1600s, tobacco was more than a plant. It was a sensation, a habit, a luxury, an addiction. By the 1620s and 1630s, demand in England was skyrocketing, and Virginia, with its rich soil and long-growing season, was ideally suited to produce it. But tobacco wasn't easy. It drained the land, requiring constant expansion into new territory. It demanded intense labor, from planting to harvesting to drying. And that labor had to come from somewhere. In the early days, it came from indentured servants, poor Englishmen and women who traded years of work for the promise of land or freedom. But as time went on, and as mortality rates dropped, a new model emerged, one built on race, ownership, and permanence. By the mid-1600s, the transition from a society of servants to a society of enslaved people was underway. African laborers had been present in Virginia since 1619, but their status was initially ambiguous. Some were baptized, and some were freed after years of work. But gradually, laws began to harden. Race became destiny. Blackness became bondage. For the plantation elite, enslaved Africans offered something servants could not: lifetime labor. No contracts, no promises of land, no rebellions for freedom. It was an inhuman system, but it was efficient. And so the fields expanded. The great tobacco plantations of Virginia were no longer humble farms. They became economic machines, driven by human suffering. And those who owned them, men like William Berkeley, Richard Bennett, and the Ludwells, rose to dominate colonial life. By the 1650s and 1660s, Virginia's power was concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. These elite planters didn't just grow crops. They governed. They held seats in the House of Burgesses, the Colonial Assembly. They controlled courts, set tax policy, and enforced laws. Many were also military commanders, judges, and merchants. Some even owned shipping lines to England. The gap between the rich and the poor widened dramatically. Most colonists, especially former servants, scraped by on small plots, burdened by debt and taxes. Meanwhile, the elites wore silk, lived in brick mansions, and drank imported French wine. This wasn't the egalitarian New World promised in pamphlets. It was a hierarchy, dressed in English lace. To protect their position, the elites enacted systems of control, both legal and psychological. They passed slave codes to prevent uprisings, banning gatherings, literacy, and mobility among enslaved people. For poor whites, they offered just enough land, just enough hope, to keep them from joining forces with the enslaved. And through the Anglican Church, they preached order, obedience, and the divine right of authority. Dissent was punished. Resistance was surveilled. And behind every law was the silent threat of violence. This was not accidental. The elites understood that their wealth sat atop a powder keg of class resentment and racial terror. Their power depended on keeping that keg from exploding. The rise of the plantation elite was not just a Virginian story. It was the blueprint for much of the American South. The language of liberty would one day echo across these hills. But here, in the 17th century, it was the liberty of a few to rule over the many. This era laid the foundation for centuries of racialized capitalism, aristocratic politics, and deep social divides. And it did so through men who saw themselves not as tyrants, but as stewards of civilization, bringing English order to a wild land. But that order was built on stolen land, stolen labor, and unyielding inequality. The plantation elite would survive wars, rebellions, and revolutions. Their descendants would sign the Declaration of Independence. Fought in the Civil War, it has shaped American politics for centuries. But it all began here, in the wake of bloodshed, in the smoke of burned villages, in the rows of tobacco fields tilled by hands that would never be free. The dream of profit had become a system of power. And that system was just getting started. By the late 1600s, the English dream in North America had evolved. What began as a desperate gamble for survival had hardened into a global ambition. No longer a scattered patchwork of struggling outposts, the colonies were being reimagined as an integral part of something far grander: the English Empire. Virginia was no longer a vulnerable experiment. It was now a profitable, structured society. Massachusetts had become a Puritan theocracy with schools, churches, and militias. New colonies, Maryland, Connecticut, Rhode Island, had begun to spring up like seedlings from the Old World's soil. And behind it all, a new force was rising: imperial strategy. The age of improvisation was over. Now came the age of structure. In 1624, after years of mismanagement and bloody conflict, King James I revoked the Virginia Company's charter. Virginia would no longer be a private venture. It would become a royal colony, directly controlled by the crown. This move marked a turning point in English colonial policy. As competition with France and Spain intensified, colonies became strategic footholds, valuable for their resources, their locations, and their role in imperial trade. What followed was a deliberate effort to centralize power and tighten control. Governors were now royal appointees. Colonial assemblies were monitored. Trade was regulated through new laws, most notably the Navigation Acts, which required all colonial goods to pass through English ports and ships. The colonies had matured, and so had England's grip on them. The rise of the empire meant the rise of systems. New bureaucracies were built to oversee colonial affairs. The Board of Trade was established in London to manage everything from laws to logistics. Military outposts were fortified. Tax systems were devised. Legal codes were enforced. The colonies were no longer left to figure things out on their own. They were increasingly drawn into a network of imperial management, economic, military, and political. But while England imposed order, it also sowed seeds of tension. Colonists, especially the emerging elite, resented interference. They wanted protection and access to trade, but also autonomy. They were loyal Englishmen, but also landowners, merchants, and governors who had tasted power. This subtle tension would simmer beneath the surface for a century. As the empire took shape, one challenge loomed large: diversity. Each colony was distinct. Virginia was aristocratic and Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan and communal. Maryland offered refuge to Catholics. Rhode Island was fiercely independent. New York had Dutch roots. Carolina had ties to the West Indies. Pennsylvania, not yet founded, would become a Quaker haven. Unifying these disparate worlds under one imperial umbrella would prove both difficult and defining. England's solution: allow local variation, but demand loyalty. Colonial assemblies could write laws, but the king could veto them. Local churches could preach, but the crown could regulate clergy. Militias could form, but only under royal charters. This delicate balance between freedom and control would define the imperial relationship for the next 100 years. Beneath the politics was an engine more powerful than any army: mercantilism. England's economy was shifting from feudal traditions to market-driven expansion. The colonies were seen as extensions of this economic system, a source of raw materials, a market for English goods, and a barrier to foreign rivals. Tobacco from Virginia, sugar from Barbados, furs from Canada, cod from New England. These commodities flowed back to English ports, enriching merchants and expanding influence. In return, colonies were flooded with English-manufactured goods, cloth, tools, weapons, and books. But the system was rigged. Colonies were forbidden to trade directly with rivals like the Dutch or French. All profit had to funnel through England. It was efficient for the mother country. For the colonies, it was lucrative but limiting. And as the merchant class grew in Boston, Charleston, and Philadelphia, whispers of economic independence began to stir. By the 1680s, English colonial holdings had stretched far beyond Jamestown. From Nova Scotia in the north to Jamaica in the south, from Barbados to Bermuda, England's empire now ringed the Atlantic like a crown of trade and conquest. The colonies became laboratories for political ideas, markets for industrial goods, and buffers against Catholic Spain and France. And at the heart of it all was a myth, the idea that the empire was a force for civilization. English leaders portrayed their expansion as bringing law, religion, and order to a savage world. But for native peoples, Africans, and many colonists themselves, the empire was not benevolence. It was bureaucracy, exploitation, and erasure. Still, the machine rolled on. Looking back on the 17th century, the transformation is staggering. 100 years earlier, England was an island nation late to the game of colonization, scarred by religious wars and dynastic instability. By 1700, it had carved a new world from the wilderness. Its ships ruled trade routes. Its soldiers guarded outposts. Its governors wielded authority in distant ports. And its settlers, hungry, hopeful, hardened, were laying the foundations for something even greater. The English Empire had arrived, but the seeds of future rebellion were already in the soil. The colonists had learned to govern themselves, to trade, to defend, to dream. They were English in name, but increasingly American in spirit. And as the 18th century dawned, a new chapter was coming, one of revolution, identity, and the ultimate question: would this empire hold, or would it break?